In today's video, we will be looking into 3 horrifying caving stories that went horribly wrong. These stories highlight that it's not just the caves themselves that are dangerous. Nature's warnings, when ignored, can lead to catastrophic consequences. As always, viewer discretion is advised. September 4th, 1967, was the second day of the expedition into the rugged Guadalupe Mountains for the 4 experienced vertical cavers: Richard Breisch, Douglas Evans, Ellsworth Rolfs, and Loren Bollinger. The group had spent the previous day inspecting a 60-foot pit, but today, their attention was focused on the challenging depths of Vanishing River Cave. With over a century of combined experience, the team knew the risks but approached their task with cautious optimism. The cave's 150-foot vertical drop and narrow passages demanded precision, and they came prepared with advanced rigging equipment, helmets, and a staggering 600 feet of rope. The environment was not as stable as it seemed. The mountainous landscape had been battered by weather fronts in recent weeks, leaving the ground around the cave's entrance soft and precarious. McClellan Ridge, where the cave entrance lay, was infamous for its unpredictable shifts in weather. Clear skies could transform into torrents within hours. Local reports had warned of a potential storm brewing, but it seemed distant, unlikely to interfere with the day's plans. By mid-afternoon, the team had successfully rigged the cave's entrance, carefully descending to its depths. At 150 feet below the surface, they explored the main chamber before moving to a secondary level approximately 100 feet up. The group worked seamlessly, each member attuned to the dangers inherent in vertical caving. Evans was the first to ascend back to the surface using Prusik knots, a technique requiring skill and endurance. The climb was steep and relentless, the walls of the cave narrowing as he approached the surface. As he emerged into daylight, a gust of wind carried the sharp scent of rain. Peering out over the surrounding terrain, he called down to his teammates, warning them that the weather was turning. His voice carried urgency, but the rest of the group, focused on packing their gear and coiling the rope, didn't immediately react. Below, Loren, Richard, and Rolfs began to feel the cave tremble faintly as the wind outside intensified. Suddenly, the sound of falling debris shattered the cave's stillness. Rocks from the unstable entrance above began to clatter downward, dislodged by the worsening weather. Loren glanced up in time to hear Evans shout, his voice cut short by the gut-wrenching sound of a body striking rock. The noise was unmistakable. It was the sound of flesh and bone meeting unyielding rock, followed by the heavy silence of realization. For a moment, none of them moved. Richard's hands froze mid-motion on the rope, and Rolfs, who had been kneeling on a ledge below, looked up, his face pale. It was Evans. There could be no doubt. After the impact, Evans fell nearly 50 feet, his body colliding with an outcropping on the 100-foot level before landing hard on the rocky floor. The impact echoed through the chamber, a brutal reminder of how quickly things could go wrong. Loren and Rolfs rushed to his side, finding him conscious but in excruciating pain. Blood poured from deep lacerations on his head, staining his helmet, which lay cracked and useless. His breaths came in shallow gasps as he groaned, clutching his side. Rolfs, a trained Red Cross first aid instructor, worked quickly to stabilize him, but the situation was dire. Evans mumbled about intense back and pelvic pain, and his movements were restricted by his injuries. Meanwhile, Richard began the climb to the surface, determined to summon help. He threw down extra clothing to keep Evans warm before disappearing into the worsening storm. Above, rain lashed the mountainside, turning the ground to mud and threatening to flood the cave's entrance. Richard's climb was grueling, his hands and legs aching as he fought the rope, which now hung damp and heavy. Back in the cave, Loren and Rolfs worked tirelessly to keep Evans alive. Rolfs monitored his breathing and pulse while Loren ascended to the surface to light a signal fire, hoping to draw rescuers to their remote location. The hours dragged on, the air growing colder and wetter as the rain outside intensified. At 6:30 p.m., Evans' shallow breaths stopped entirely. Rolfs, exhausted but resolute, began CPR. Every chest compression felt like a battle against time, his hands shaking with effort. He alternated with rescue breaths, shouting encouragement to Evans as if sheer willpower could bring him back. Minutes turned into an hour, but Evans showed no signs of recovery. Finally, at 7:25 p.m., Rolfs, his energy and hope drained, ceased his efforts. Evans was gone. The tragedy weighed heavily on the team, but the worsening rain left no time for mourning. The situation was quickly becoming dangerous for every single one of them inside the cave. They had no option but to head for an escape, leaving their lifeless friend behind as the water was pouring inside from all directions. Fearing the cave might flood, Rolfs began his ascent, each pull on the rope a Herculean effort. When Lauren attempted his own climb shortly after, disaster struck again. 30 feet from the surface, his aging rope snapped, sending him swinging wildly into the cave wall. He landed hard, but managed to regain control, using his remaining strength to stabilize himself against the walls. Though shaken, Loren quickly assessed the situation, realizing how precarious their position was, with the storm worsening and the ropes compromised. He quickly worked to secure a safer line and called for help, aware that every moment counted to prevent further disaster. Adrenaline surged as he scrambled to reattach himself to the safety line, his heart pounding as he fought to regain control. By sheer determination, he completed the climb, collapsing at the surface in the rain-soaked mud. They were safe, but their friend was still inside. Soon the weather and conditions inside the cave became even worse, making the body recovery operation impossible. The tragedy hit them all hard. They took shelter nearby and spent the entire night silent, grieving over their lost companion. The next morning, as the storm became weaker, they returned with a rescue team. It took hours to recover Evans's body, an effort further hampered by the remote location and treacherous conditions. The group finally reached a roadhead by midnight, their grief and exhaustion palpable. In the days that followed, the survivors reflected on the accident. Evans's fall had been caused by a perfect storm of factors: the funnel-shaped entrance to the cave, the unstable debris loosened by rain, and the absence of a backup safety line. It's a lesson about nature and the wilderness, and how people with more than 20 years of caving experience could find themselves at its mercy. In this next story, the cavers had been given enough warnings and were cautioned about the risks, yet their overconfidence led them to gamble with their lives. On 25th February, 1967, two friends, Ralph Bucca and John Locke, ventured into Overholt Blowing Cave in the afternoon, undeterred by the biting cold that gnawed at their exposed skin. Their layers of clothing, a combination of long-sleeve shirts, jackets, and outer suits, were intended to shield them from the harsh conditions. Before entering Overholt Blowing Cave, Ralph and John had a brief chat with the owner, G. Dallas McKeever, who cautioned them about the hazards. He spoke plainly. The cave's frigid waters and freezing temperatures were relentless, especially during midwinter. McKeever didn't forbid their entry, but strongly advised against it, emphasizing how quickly cold and exhaustion could set in. Despite his warnings, Ralph and John felt confident. They had insulated clothing and considered themselves prepared. The seriousness of McKeever's tone barely registered. To them, the cave was another challenge to overcome, not the potential trap he described. Brushing aside his concerns, they believed they could handle whatever lay ahead, a belief that would soon unravel inside the unforgiving depths. But as they descended into the cave, its icy grip grew inescapable. The cave was a place of extremes, its frigid waters and damp air conspiring to test their resolve. The pair navigated the initial passages with relative ease, their headlights casting wavering beams on the wet, glistening walls. The air was dense, the silence broken only by their breathing and the occasional splash of water beneath their boots. They reached the infamous Dardanelles Passage about 30 minutes into their exploration. This stretch, a 500-foot-long crawl through freezing water, was notorious for its challenges, even under favorable conditions. As they began the crawl, Ralph immediately felt the cold water biting into him like needles, soaking through his layers and seeping into every pore. The water was relentless, clinging to their skin and drawing away what little warmth their bodies produced. Each forward movement was an effort of will, their limbs screaming against the numbing chill. John, ahead of Ralph, moved with deliberate caution, calling back occasionally to ensure his partner was close behind. By the time they emerged into the mountain room, Ralph's condition had begun to deteriorate. He flexed his fingers, attempting to restore sensation, but the numbness remained. His hands felt like blocks of ice, his legs stiff and unresponsive. "We should turn back," John suggested, noticing Ralph's slow movements and labored breathing. Ralph nodded reluctantly, his pride giving way to the grim reality of their situation. The return journey quickly became an ordeal. The Dardanelles passage, so challenging on the way in, now felt insurmountable. The freezing water seemed colder, the crawl spaces tighter. Ralph's body was succumbing to the effects of hypothermia, his strength draining with every inch he advanced. His movements grew sluggish, his breath shallow and rapid. When they reached the halfway point, Ralph collapsed onto the wet ground, his hands trembling uncontrollably. John knelt beside him, panic rising in his chest. "Come on, Ralph, we're almost there," he urged, pulling Ralph up. But Ralph's body refused to cooperate. His legs buckled, and he slumped back into the icy water. The cave, once a place of curiosity and adventure, had become an unrelenting enemy. John realized he had to act quickly. Dragging Ralph's limp body through the tight crawl spaces was a grueling task. His own strength was waning, his muscles screaming in protest as he heaved Ralph forward inch by inch. The cold was a relentless thief, stealing away their energy and willpower. Ralph's head lolled to the side, his face pale and his lips tinged blue. His eyes fluttered closed, and for a terrifying moment, John thought he had stopped breathing. "Stay with me, Ralph," John muttered, his voice trembling. He shook Ralph gently, eliciting a faint groan. It was enough to spur him on. John pushed through the last stretch of the Dardanelles, every movement a battle against the cave's icy grip. By the time they emerged into the main passage leading to the entrance, John's hands were raw, his body trembling uncontrollably. But Ralph was slipping further away. His skin was ashen, his breath coming in shallow gasps. His body was stiff and unresponsive, a clear sign of advanced hypothermia. John knew time was running out. He half-dragged, half-carried Ralph through the final stretch, the faint light of the entrance barely visible through the darkness. As they stumbled out into the freezing night, John's lungs burned with the effort. He laid Ralph down in the nearby shed, frantically stripping off his wet clothes and replacing them with dry ones. The stove inside the shed offered a faint glimmer of warmth, but it wasn't enough. Ralph's body remained cold, his pulse weak and erratic. John rubbed Ralph's limbs, trying to restore circulation, but the lack of response was terrifying. John realized he couldn't do this alone. He sprinted to find McKeever, who quickly joined him in the shed. Together, they carried Ralph to the house, their desperation mirrored in the urgency of their movements. Inside, they worked tirelessly to revive him. McKeever boiled water for hot compresses, while John continued to rub Ralph's limbs, fighting against the clock. Ralph's breath grew fainter, his body teetering on the edge of life and death. It took another 2 hours before Ralph regained full consciousness, his body finally beginning to recover from the brutal ordeal. Ralph was minutes away from death, saved only by John's determination and the relentless efforts to warm him. The cave had pushed them to their limits, a stark reminder of the unyielding power of nature and the razor-thin line between survival and tragedy. For Ralph, the experience was a humbling lesson in respect for the elements. For John, it was a testament to the strength of the human spirit and the lengths one would go to save a friend. The final story demonstrates how, within the depths of a cave, a single second is all it takes for a calm exploration to spiral into a desperate fight for survival. On the 25th of May, 1970, in the rolling hills of Pennsylvania, 3 young cavers, Tom O'Halloran, 18, O'Neill Orsby, 24, and Del Maes, 20, set out to explore Big Ridge Cave. What was meant to be an adventurous day underground soon spiraled into a race against time, forcing the trio to face not just the cave's treacherous passages, but their own limits of endurance and survival. Big Ridge Cave, known for its narrow passageways and damp, unstable rock formations. But to the 3 young explorers, the thrill of descending into the deep was a test of courage, a rite of passage for those keen to unravel the secrets hidden beneath the Earth's surface. Tom, a relative newcomer to the world of caving, had only been involved in the activity for a few months. This was his first major expedition, and he was eager to prove his mettle. O'Neill, a seasoned caver, had been on countless trips like this, and Del, equally experienced, was both a guide and a friend to the group. The adventure began as the 3 descended into the cave's dark mouth. The sound of their footfalls echoed off the rock walls as they made their way toward the first obstacle, the stream passage. It was here, in the darkness and dampness of the cave, that their troubles would begin. The cave's path was winding, with steep inclines and drops that required the use of rappelling gear. As they approached a particularly treacherous section of the cave, Tom began to feel a sense of unease. The air was thick with humidity, and his breath came in quick bursts as he focused on securing his ropes. They reached a narrow fissure that sloped down into a deep drop. O'Neill had gone ahead, signaling to Tom and Dell to follow. Dell was next in line, carefully testing each foothold before proceeding. Tom, however, had trouble keeping his footing on the slippery surface. The moisture in the air and the mud-covered rocks made it nearly impossible to maintain a steady grip. As he descended the fissure, his foot slipped. The cave, which had been quiet except for the occasional drip of water from the stalactites, suddenly seemed to come alive with a terrifying noise as Tom slid uncontrollably down the rock face. His body, in an attempt to regain control, crashed against the jagged walls. He slid, helpless, over 8 feet down. The speed of his fall was alarming, and in an instant, his knee collided with a rock outcrop. A sharp, agonizing pain shot up his leg, and he felt his body slam into the bottom with a sickening thud. The panic set in immediately. Tom could feel the blood rushing to his head as the adrenaline surged through his veins. His knee throbbed with intense pain, and his vision blurred. He gasped for air, struggling to comprehend what had just happened. Dell, who was a few feet behind him, heard the crash and immediately turned, his heart racing in his chest. Dell shouted, his voice echoing through the narrow passage. Tom managed a weak groan, his hand clutching his knee. His knee was bleeding heavily, and a quick look at it confirmed the severity of the injury. What he had initially thought was a simple bruise turned out to be a deep gash, exposing the muscle beneath. O'Neill, hearing the commotion from the front, hurried back toward Tom. When he saw the injury, his expression darkened with concern. He quickly knelt beside Tom, assessing the situation. The cut on Tom's knee was worse than they had anticipated. It was deep, running along the side of his kneecap, and the blood was pooling around it, making the situation more urgent. Panic began to set in among the group, but O'Neill, staying calm under pressure, knew they had to act fast. "We need to get you out of here," O'Neill said, his voice steady despite the mounting urgency. Dell nodded in agreement, already preparing the ropes for an ascent. The group quickly realized that it was not only the injury to Tom's knee that they had to contend with. They were also in a difficult spot, far from the entrance and with no easy route to the surface. The thought of an emergency rescue crossed their minds, but the cave's narrow passages and the sheer distance to the surface made that an unlikely option. O'Neill instructed Dell to set up a belay system. They would need to hoist Tom out, but the tight space meant that each movement had to be deliberate. Dell worked quickly, securing the ropes and making sure everything was in place. Tom, now pale from the pain and loss of blood, could barely hold his composure. Every movement of his leg sent waves of excruciating pain through his body, and he fought the urge to scream. The team worked together, with Dell anchoring the ropes while O'Neill and Tom moved slowly, trying to relieve the pressure on the injured knee. The ascent began. Tom's body jerked with each pull, his weight making it difficult for the others to lift him. As they moved upward, every inch felt like a battle against gravity, but the team was determined. Minutes turned into what felt like hours as they finally reached the top of the drop. The strain on their muscles was unbearable, but they had to keep moving. By the time they had reached the top of the first drop, Tom was exhausted. His breathing was ragged, his knee still bleeding, but there was a sense of relief. They were nearly out of the cave. However, this was not over. They still had to ascend several more levels before reaching the surface. As the team made their way through the cave, Tom's condition deteriorated further. His body shook from the cold, and the blood loss left him weak and disoriented. O'Neill and Dell kept him moving, one step at a time. Finally, the group reached the cave's entrance. The sunlight pierced through the darkness as they emerged, bringing with it a momentary sense of relief. Tom was still in immense pain, but they had made it. Rescue teams were called, and Tom was rushed to the hospital. His knee required 8 stitches, and he was placed on a rigorous recovery plan. Despite the severity of the injury, he was fortunate, this time. His experience serves as a chilling reminder of the dangers that lurk beneath the surface, and how even the smallest misstep can change everything. The incident at Big Ridge Cave is a stark warning for anyone venturing into the dark depths of the earth. No matter how experienced, no one is immune to the perils that lie beneath.